Hi, good evening everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'm exceptionally loud by nature, so I'm going to try and not have the microphone take that to another level. Alright, so this is the part where I pretend that I'm not incredibly nervous, even though I am shaking intensely inside. Anyway, good evening everyone. So apparently this is the part where I'm supposed to get up here and tell you all my story. But if you really think about it, I'm still writing it. And although I have no idea how my story will end, I'm going to take this opportunity to tell you all how it all began. Somewhere along the coast of Australia, about 3 decades ago now, a Palestinian woman and an Irish father became parents to me. Australian made from imported ingredients. That's what I like to say about myself. Growing up in the 90s, I guess you could summarize the start to my story somewhere in the midst of a typical divorced family at the time. My parents' marriage didn't last much long after I was born, and the custody battles that followed were never easy. I guess in hindsight, my story was I knew that was going to happen. I guess in hindsight, the worst battle of my childhood was in fact as a result of who the judge gave sole custody to of me, my mother. Now, aside from the basic outline that I have often drawn attention to online about my having grown up in an abusive household, I've never actually gone into detail explaining why I refer to my time with her as having been a not so great childhood. There's so much I could say about those first 22 years of my life, but with 20 minutes at my disposal, here's a rough timeline. My parents officially divorced when I was 8 years of age. Although, as I mentioned, they separated soon after I was born, their divorce marked the time where I recall that my life started to fall apart. Both my parents moved on with their new partners long before I can even remember. My earliest memories of both of them begin when they were each already with their second partners. And my earliest memories of living with both my mother and her boyfriend are almost all abusive in nature, at least of some account. Now, without skipping over too much of those early years, let's talk about my school life. I remember my time in primary school going something along the lines of this. A daily back and forth between my mother and I, of first her, reminding me of why I was good for nothing, blaming my apparent horrible personality and lack of intellect on being no fault of her own, but rather the result of me being my father's daughter. And second, my continued acceptance of her abusive behaviour, regardless of which form it took. Oh, and let's not forget the teachers that I had mistakenly opened up to about everything. Teachers who then took it upon themselves to decide if I was in fact telling the truth, before then reporting everything back to my mother, after they decided amongst themselves that I was only attention seeking. The drive home after that meeting that my mother had had with my teachers was one of the worst evenings I have ever experienced in my life. I was the nuisance that she wished she'd never had, a mistake from her previous life, embodied in me as her daily reminder. The child that on her 13th birthday she declared as needing to feel grateful because, as she declared, I wouldn't have been there if it weren't for her apparent faith. The child that she would often declare as the kid she wished she could swap for any other student in my Year 6 class. And the kid that got left out of every professional family photo, because at the end of the day, that apparently wasn't really my family. I was the eldest of 4 children in that house, but I was more like a second mother than a big sister. Which brings me now to my high school years, perhaps the most testing time for any misunderstood teenager. Throughout those years, my mother continued to remind me, in so many ways, how much she never loved me, how I was just a means of helping her in life, like a housemaid that was in no way viewed upon as a daughter. And my stepdad was everything but a dad. At one point, for 2 years, I battled with a back and forth relationship with that man, trying to enforce the standards of a father-daughter relationship. But instead, all I got was one where he seemed to confuse his role with my mother with me. When I finally built up the courage to tell my mother about all of this, after having spent those 2 years convincing myself that everything happening with him was just a complete misunderstanding, and that if I did tell her, I would only add to the pain and ruin that this family was already in. I received quite possibly the most inexcusable response from a mother to a daughter. 12-year-old me had just told her almost everything that he'd been doing to me throughout those previous 2 years, and then I was asked to leave. I was moved out of the main house and put out into the granny flat to live with my step-grandmother, whilst my mother spent time to find a way to deal with what she had just been told. I was told so many odd and peculiar things in the aftermath of that event, but there were always a few things in particular that she said that stood out to me the most. "How do you think this makes me feel?" she asked. "You couldn't find a better time to have told me this? Did you like it? Is that why it took you so long to come and tell me? Why didn't you stand up for yourself? What, did you think he would hurt you? What's wrong with you? You're never allowed to dress like that in that house again. You encouraged it." At 12 years of age, I believed every single word she accused me of. And in the years that followed, not only did I continue to believe it and more, I would go on to battle with those beliefs alone, privately, within my own mind. Words do not suffice in the expression of utter pain and overall betrayal that I felt at the time. But like I said, I only have 20 minutes. So now that you all have context, let's fast forward to the day that I ran away from home. It's July 22nd, 2014, and I'm 22 years old. I'm about to do the hardest thing that I've ever had to do in my life. Leave the only family that I've ever known and run away. To convince myself that it's not selfish to want a happier life, that it's not wrong for me to go against my mother, even though everyone around me kept telling me she's abusive. And to leave behind the only 3 true friends that I had ever had in my entire life at that point: my brother and my 2 sisters. Now, the day before I left, I had no idea I would be running away, just 24 hours later. Nothing was planned. I was heading off to university after having an awful time with my mother the night before, where we were up until after 1 a.m. arguing. So when I arrived on campus, I called one of my friends to confide. Now, this friend had been trying to convince me for over a year at this point to get out of there, because in his words, that wasn't a normal family. I spent years convincing myself that he and everyone alike just didn't understand, because like my mother always said, it's because we're Arab. It's because we just have a stricter culture than most. But in the end, that's meant to make us better women. And she could not have been more wrong. The audacity, blaming her abusive nature on such a beautiful culture, was abhorrent to say the very least. I guess blaming her ways on culture was the only scapegoat that she could allude to mask her own ill intentions. Anyway, after a long debate over the phone, my friend found my father's mobile number online and convinced me to try and call him. Now, for your knowledge, at this point, I had not seen nor spoken to my father in at least 5 years. And prior to that, I had had an on and off relationship with him, through no fault of his own, for about a year, after having also not spoken to him for the 6 years prior to that. I eventually did summon the courage to call him, and my heart began sinking into my gut. He answered, and hearing his voice as a now mature adult, with the mindset that I had finally accepted that he was right all along growing up, about everything, was perhaps the start to one of the most profound moments I have ever experienced to date. Now, it's probably appropriate for me to mention that at this point, this was my 3rd attempt at trying to run away from my mother. So now, not only was I nervous in my ability to see this through, but so too was my father. Nervous to go through the pain of all of this again, only to potentially watch his daughter run back to her mother once more out of fear. But not this time. This time, there was no room for guilt trip-induced second thoughts. This time, I was going for the home run. And if you think about it, quite literally, I was running home, to the home where I actually belonged. Running away has got to be the greatest dichotomy one can ever experience. It is equally both utterly terrifying and extremely relieving. And as many of you might know, I went on to then live the next 8 years with my grandparents, my father's parents, which is where I still am today. Which brings me to the chapter my story is up to now. I stand here as a 30-year-old woman who has devoted the last 8 years to rewriting my story, being my own author this time, instead of having someone else write out all my lines for me. I finally have had a taste of liberty. Now, the first few years out, in the spirit of transparency, was not at all what I expected them to be. Unbeknownst to me at the time, by leaving, I had begun what I would later realize to have been the start of my healing journey. Grieving the loss of my childhood, the loss of the mother I should have had, and worst of all, the loss of time with family members whom I was forbidden to see, to which I would never get back. When you leave an abusive environment, it's only when you're on the outside looking in where you start to truly realize just how bad everything was. And so, the emotions that followed from all of that resulted in me seeking therapy. I was told I had PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and now I had to go on this mental health journey. Fast forward to today, and I can confidently say that with time, I feel, comes a level of comfort that I have never felt in my entire life, not even as a child. That healed comfort has allowed me to continue writing my story, further expanding the chapters into new developments. After having graduated from teaching, the year after running away from my mother, I worked in Australia for a couple of years before heading off to London for a while as a primary school teacher. I also traveled a lot, started my own business, and to my surprise, I eventually even started creating content online, sharing my story with the world. I learned how to unlearn so much from my past. Today, I am no longer the girl who sat hiding underneath the math stairwell in school, trying to convince God through prayer why he should make an exception for me if I were to go through with any sin to commit against my life. I am no longer the girl who makes excuses for her mother or stepfather just because they claim to not know any better, or that this was just how it was done in our culture. I am not who I was meant to be, but who I wanted to be. With all the challenges this life has presented with me thus far, the biggest takeaway I would like to share with you all is a saying I hold dear to me. Life isn't about finding yourself, it's about creating yourself. Just because my past was filled with so much hurt and deceit doesn't mean all that negativity defines who I am. The power, the choice, still resides with me. I, you, the individual, holds the key to being whoever you would like to be. So if you take but one moral away from my story today, please let it be this. You need not be defined by the walls to which around you were placed, but rather by the doors that when opened, opportunity you chase. Thank you.